everybody. We see students in our undergraduate classes, graduate students, family members, colleagues. Thank you so much for coming to Fordham tonight. And many thanks to the Center for Orthodox Christian Studies for sponsoring tonight's event. And we are just so thrilled to welcome you to a conversation about my dear friend and colleague George Demacopoulos' new book, Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium, Hymns, Empire, and the Narrowing of Christian Identity, that has just come out this fall with the Dunbar and Oaks imprint of Harvard University Press. And George, as many of you already know, is the Father John Mandorf and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies here at Fordham. And we are truly so honored and honestly in awe of George's ability to hang on to what I think of as like the thread of creative, intellectual life of research and writing that's so impressive in the midst of doing such incredible work as a leader for the center that has really made an imprint on kind of the global landscape of Orthodox Christian studies and ecumenical relations. So it's just incredible that George has managed to produce this monograph of such incredible caliber and quality. We are just thrilled to have a conversation this evening about his discoveries of premodern Christian attitudes towards violence and war through the lens of hymns and hymnography. The book raises questions about the relationship between liturgy and politics, the sacralization of violence, the relationship between religious devotion and broader structures of empire and violence. So it's a really stunning achievement, and we're thrilled to welcome our panelists for this conversation. And we are going to begin this evening's remarks with Dr. Susan Ashbrook-Harvey, who's the Willard Prescott and Annie McLennan Smith Professor of History and Religion at Brown University. Many of the graduate students know her work and read her work in our seminars. She specializes in late antique and Byzantine Christianity with Syriac studies as her particular focus. She's published widely on topics relating to asceticism, women and gender, hymnography, and piety in late antique Christianity. And she has a new book coming out too, Ministries of Song, Women's Voices in Ancient Syriac Christianity. And this will appear later this fall with University of California Press. And then we will be hearing from Alexander Lingas, a professor of music at the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in the UK. And he was just here with us. Many of you came to the visit of the Patriarch and the incredible choral performance that Alexander directed. He's the music director and founder of that incredible vocal ensemble, Capella Romana. He's also a professor of music and associate director of the Institute of Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary here nearby in Yonkers. And for the fall term of 2024, Dr. Lingas was a visiting professor in the Department of Music at UCLA. So we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Lingas as well. And finally, we have with us Nina Glibatic. She's an assistant professor of liturgical studies at Yale Divinity School and their Institute of Sacred Music. She's a historian of liturgy, of ritual practices of the Eastern Christian world, and she works on lived religion and manuscripts tracing how worship was shaped in Byzantium and the Slavic and Near Eastern encounters. And she's an incredible conversation partner for this book, as her research ranges from the history of Byzantine Eucharist, ritual practice surrounding women's life, the role of worship in forging cultural and national identities. She's originally from Belgrade, Serbia, and we are thrilled to welcome her to the conversation tonight too. So we'll have about 7 to 10 minutes for each panelist's remarks, and then we'll have Dr. Demacopoulos have a chance to respond, and then we'll open it up for conversation and wrap up about 7:15. So welcome everybody, and I'll turn it over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenna, and good evening. I need to start by thanking Fordham University and the Center for Orthodox Christian Studies for the honor of joining this event, this splendid occasion today, and thank you especially to George for such a magnificent reason for celebration. You see us all clutching our copies of this beautiful book, and it really is a magnificent and excellent book. And more than that, it's an important book. All the more so for the urgencies of our own particular historical moment. There is much here for us to heed. I normally work in things much older than the other panelists, so I'm going first because I'm the one that comes where there's no evidence to answer the questions I would like to ask this book. So I'm going to raise questions that my fellow panelists, I hope, are going to address. Let me start with the book itself. Sacralizing Violence is a study of the language of violence and war in Byzantine hymnography. George focuses on several specific cases, looking each time at the sung language, or the language that was sung, of God's enemies and the prayers for faithful response. First, he treats the language of the biblical Psalms, which people often hear almost mythically, as imagery of a past so distant as to be ahistorical. Similarly, George argues, the language of earliest Christian hymns absorbs violence into and through the saving passion of Christ, rather than sacralizing violence between and among historical persons. Then there comes a change. George argues that during the 6th and 7th centuries, the inherited language is reset in response to specific historical events of rebellion and war as they happened. With these events came a literalizing and a sharpening of prior rhetorical patterns. Hymns now began to castigate God's enemies, recognizable in the historical present, and in particular to castigate Jews as God's enemies. And with more to come, in the wake of wars Byzantium would fight against Persians and Arab Muslims, by the 7th century, we have the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, which marked a dramatic change in liturgical festive celebrations, marking a military event, not an event in the life of Christ for the church to celebrate. A culmination comes in the 10th century with the liturgical rite of blessing for military service and burial on behalf of the empire as God's chosen people against all enemies, rendering political history into a cosmic battle between good and evil, played out between human persons in wars fought between human political entities. That's the barest of sketches and does no justice to the careful work that George conducts throughout the entire book, but I wanted those pegs for us to have to hang on to here. George makes two dramatic methodological moves in this study. The first is to insist that liturgy, or Christian worship, is not something that happens outside of time or history or politics or society. Liturgy is something we do in real time with real life ramifications and results. Liturgy is part of the world we live in and the lives that we live. It has a human history and hence a social history of meaning in the lives of those who participate. The second move is to take hymns seriously as media that nourish and sustain the church as a community. I just did a workshop for our graduate program in religious studies. They have a required theory and method course in critical theory of religion. We just had a session on media and imagined communities, and they brought me in to talk about hymns. Not something the Americanists were expecting, but we managed. Hymns are the most common and most effective form of presenting religious teaching to a worshiping community. They are received by, accessible to, and sung together by everyone who comes. These are not the works of high intellectuals or learned theologians studying their books together with students and scholars, although their theology is often very sophisticated. These are short musical poems, sung and heard, carried in one's ears, hummed in the rhythms of daily life, sung together with familiar refrains and responses, even if only Lord have mercy, Kyrie eleison, Alleluia, or Amen, inscribing the teachings of the church into the heart of the listener and the listener as singer. These are two extremely important aspects, that liturgy has a social history and that hymns are an effective form of teaching. These are two extremely important aspects of the religious ritual and of George's book to keep in mind. So now let me raise some questions about this work. I have a flood of questions, and my fellow panelists will be addressing some of them, and then George will have to be addressing the rest. I present these questions first as a historian, but I normally work back in the 6th century, but I offer them also for the present. For Orthodox liturgy is a living history, and its instance is a template for others to consider. What can we know about how these hymns were sung and received in their particular historical settings? Did other liturgical components highlight or overshadow their verses? Do sermons refer to them or quote them? Did Byzantine authors refer to these hymns outside of liturgy? Do we have any indication of reception, of liturgical listening that may have allowed diverse methods of interpretation and of memory? Sacred stories are capacious narratives. They contain multiple narratives, never just one. We do have evidence from the ancient world that congregations could hear holy stories in different ways, with different meanings. In the book, George addresses some of these matters from the perspective of political and ecclesiastical policies, mandating when these hymns should be sung, how often, and by whom, for example, and where, throughout the Byzantine Empire, for example. For purposes of reflection, especially on the present, I want to turn to the perspective of what in religious studies we call lived experience. And for my purposes today, that is the experience of the person in the congregation, in the pews, except there weren't pews, but whatever the equivalent to that would, standing, you know. So, hymns are part of liturgy as a complex ritual. The Byzantines, like us, participated in liturgy's soundscape amidst a full sensory experience. Ritual components surround. There's a special building, the church. It's adorned with icons and frescoes that command one's view. Incense fills the air. Divine presence is there, not the scents or smells of daily life. There is sequenced movement into and out of the altar as the doors of the iconostasis open and close, and priest or deacons or subdeacons or altar servers process in and out in varying patterns. Chanters, choir, clergy, and congregations sing in dialogic patterns of exchange. There are invocations, litanies, supplications, petitions, hymns, readings, responses, collective prayers, refrains, offerings, praise, rejoicing, and gratitude. Voices sound from the altar, from the lectern, from the chanter's stand, from the choir's place, and from the nave, throughout the nave, where the congregation is. In Orthodox liturgy, there are no real pauses and no real silences. There is a continuous feast of sound and movement, of sight, sense, textures, and tastes. Time itself is adorned. How do specific words from a specific moment, a specific hymn, stand out? Especially if children are fussing and babies are crying, people are shuffling. Liturgical behavior, as we often say, is sometimes nothing short of holy pandemonium. Jacob of Sarug in the 6th century used to complain about parishioners who were present in their bodies while their minds were off in the marketplace. Location, performance, ritual. These elements contributed to what was heard and how it was heard, to what was sung and why it was sung. What evidence do we have for these hymns as part of Byzantine religious life beyond their liturgical moment? George discusses the Feast of the Elevation of the Cross as an example, and this is a feast that the Orthodox celebrated just last month, so it's it's nearby. In it, the short hymn, O Lord, Save Thy People, slightly different translation, depends on which version you're singing, is sung in its triumphant tone 1, and it is repeated several times at dramatic moments through the orthros, or matins, and divine liturgy. It is short enough and memorable enough with that punchy melody that it has, that one carries it and hears it and hums it long after the service has ended. But what else does one remember or hear with it? What ritual moments framed that hymn? Whose voice sang it? What other hymns? What other songs? What other sacred teachings in the liturgy came before this hymn and after this hymn? What ritual elements highlighted it? Or what ritual aspects mitigated or even detracted from or diminished its sound? What if it was sung and you didn't hear it because you were dealing with fussing children, for example? Last week I saw someone whose heel fell off her shoe, and that took a whole 15 minutes over in that corner. This is the sort of thing that affects what you hear and how. Was the very familiarity of the hymn a factor that lessened its impact? Did a beloved melody obscure the words, the military or politically coded words of this hymn? Perhaps one even might have left the services not humming the violence of the militarily coded hymn, but rather another hymn altogether that you really like, perhaps from Vespers, perhaps the cosmological piece of the hymn Phos Ilaron, or Gladsome Light, a hymn so ancient that in the mid-4th century St. Basil of Caesarea said no one could remember its origins. What would make one hymn sound amidst others through the course of one's day? And finally, how does one enable liturgical listening that hears words with true meaning? And what are true meanings? Who gets to decide? Are the words of scripture or hymns only to be heard in allegorized or mythical timeless terms? How, when, and to what end does one call the church to consider the historical realities of its sacred words, whether sung or preached? Religions have always served political purposes, and certainly they serve political order. The Parthenon on the glorious Acropolis of ancient Athens was a war monument dedicated to the goddess Athena, just as the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross is also a war monument dedicated to Christ. How should the church remember its past, its own past? And how can its history be remembered as sacred history, yet also remembered responsibly, ethically, and morally? Orthodox liturgy is a powerful center into which all of our histories, human histories, collective and individual, are poured. Each week, Orthodox pray among the living and with the dead. They pray for the future in time and eternity. What do historical events mean in such a context? How and what should one sing? Thank you, George, for this book, and thank you, the listeners.
Thank you, George, for writing this book, and Susan for summarizing it so well and introducing all the themes, and also speaking about it so eloquently. I mean, for me, this was a book that inspired me to look further. So we'll just take it as given that I really love the book, and that I found the overall historical thread of it convincing, and following it along was great fun. And for me, actually, I kept wanting to sort of at various stages of it look, okay, off to the side here. Well, what about this? What about that? inspired me to look further, actually. And there are many points of entry to this book, but one of them that I just couldn't resist was because in his introduction, George makes the declaration, this is not a book about Byzantine music. So,
Thought it let you off the hook.
so yeah, so on the other hand, though, he's very careful then to acknowledge all the sorts of things like the embodiment of singing, and and the way that music can influence the brain and all those other things. So he realizes that world is out there. So what I'd like to do actually this evening is just follow a few threads myself, just because I got interested. And perhaps then that will help answer some of the types of questions that Susan just mentioned. So, so one of the things I'll just mention briefly, we've already heard about the Feast of the Holy Cross. That's something that I was already intimately familiar with because I did a whole album of excerpts of the Rite of Hagia Sophia for the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, which we just performed 2 weeks ago again in Vancouver, BC, with our friends from Stanford University providing the 11 seconds of ring time of Hagia Sophia. So some of the hymns that George discusses are actually on this album. And so actually when the fact that they're there, in and of itself can give you some musical examples of, to consider the effect of what music does. So Susan mentioned this hymn, Lord Save Your People. Not thy people, I have your people here. And in fact, there were two melodies that were used in the Middle Ages. One was very simple, and one was very elaborate and assigned to the professional choir. And I'm not sure if there is any sound. If not, I'll have to try to sing some of this from memory. So, all right. So I'll have to sing some from memory. So the modern tune of this hymn is So son Kyrie ton laon su ke vlogison tin klirono mian su. The medieval tune is So son Kyrie ton laon su ke vlogison tin klirono mian su. And then the tune that the professional choir would sing is about 6 times as long and very beautiful, and I see if I can remember it. So son ki it extends the melody out, so you're just kind of the sound swirls around you, and so that it's the music actually that carries you forward more than the text. So that's one of the things when reading these hymns, realizing that even the same text in certain circumstances could have different musical settings, and the content of that setting could really affect the experience of it. Let's see, let's go on. There we go. So my colleague at Bisera Pencheva in this Icons of Sound project has actually, she sort of listened to some of the things that we performed as part of this project, and she wrote actually an article or two about this, where she was looking in particular at these two hymns. One, the Kontakion of the Cross, and which has to do with the return of the cross after the Persian Wars, and the other is this hymn by the Emperor Leo, so written centuries later, but inviting people to come worship the cross, which was being set out on certain days in Constantinople for people to venerate in Hagia Sophia. And it talks very frankly about struggling against or smashing the might of Ishmael, so fight against the Muslims during this period. And one of the things that Professor Pencheva noted that when we sang it was that the kind of melodic climax of the hymn is when it starts talking about the emperor. And when it says, your faithful king's boast, and that's the musical high point of the piece. So, so the people listening would absolutely get the message of what was going on in that work, and it was composed by an emperor. So, So anyway, again, many threads I could follow, but just for the sake of time, I wanted to talk a little bit about the two offices, rather, these two services that are George deals with in the end of the book and are in the appendices. And one of them is a memorial set of hymns for people who've fallen in battle. And the way when it was edited, you can, if you see, look at the edition here, and you look in the left column, you see folio 10R, which is where it starts, and then all of a sudden the actual text of it begins on folio 12, so a couple pages later. And so what's really interesting about this particular service is that it happens to be just integrated into a normal service book for the season of Lent, or proceeding up to Lent. So it's a Saturday where you're commemorating all the fallen, kind of like a Memorial Day. And in this case, what this does, this particular office for people fallen in battle, is just integrated as an extra set of hymns if you want to do it within the full text. So the kind of the ascription of it, what it is on the Saturday of Beat Fair Sunday, we sing this, but then it mentions also we commemorate these soldiers. And then, but you have to go, a few folios later, then when it says, right here, sort of right there, it says, Eteros kanon istus en polemis. So it's for those, and here's an alternate canon, a type of set of hymns, for those who had fallen in battle. So here we see that this commemoration is integrated into the normal liturgical life of people. This was just something that you could do, just again, like a requiem for fallen soldiers on a day when you normally pray for the dead anyway. So the other text, which is this text for people going into battle, which is an unusual one in all sorts of respects, is not in a normal service book, but it is tacked on to a set of treatises on military strategy. And the editor, the Italian editor of it, in some ways didn't seem not to have known what he was looking at. He doesn't catch all sorts of references of where some of the hymns are actually from. He doesn't include the musical modes, which are listed with each hymn, and so on. So when you actually sort of pick up these, thanks to the library in Florence, which put it online, you see a lot of details that, even though there's no music written here, that actually give you precisely some of those kind of details that Susan was talking about a kind of intertextuality, calling to mind other hymns. And the reason this is true with this office is for two reasons. In some cases, there are hymns that are just picked out of other services. And in other cases, what we have are hymns that are metrically identical to other hymns with other texts. So, and it seems, that's true of this other office for the people who've already died in battle. But the models for that are very generic ones. They're ones that, you just, the models don't really tell you anything. But here, it seems that the person who wrote this or compiled this office made very deliberate choices. So the very first set of hymns is sung to the tune of a hymn for the angels that talks about the heavenly ranks or hosts or tagmata, which also means a kind of military designation. So the very first hymn is you are going to be calling to memory a hymn about heavenly armies. Then the next, so that's for the first three hymns are sung to that tune. Then the next thing that you get in this is a hymn borrowed from the offices of the third Sunday of Lent, when the cross is venerated, and which you can find the music for in other manuscripts, like this one from Grana Ferrata, or say this one from Mount Sinai, and this particular hymn, which I'll just read you the beginning of the translation of is as follows. Lord, who fought alongside the most gentle David to subordinate the foreigner, fight alongside our faithful emperor, or Vasilevs. So that's how the hymn begins. And the tune for this, if I can read this, is it kind of also tells you pretty much, you know, what you're fighting for and who's doing what. So it's Osimahi saskirie to praota to David. So that's David. You get there's the David, the gentle David. Hypotaxe. So that's making them submit. Tonalophilon. So those are the bad guys that he's subordinating. And then the kings. Tus pistus Simon Vasilis symbolemison. This has a textual variant, so it says symbolemison, fight alongside with them. So, you can hear it's almost a kind of martial sounding melody. When you start singing about the emperor knocking out those guys, it goes up. So anyway, these are the sorts of things that once you sort of add music into the mix, and also looking at questions of liturgical context, that you can find out. So anyway, many thanks to George for opening all these doors, and I look forward to exploring the rest of the castle.
So I'm going to get us right into the 21st century as I think through George's book. And as the third presenter this evening, I find myself in the enviable position of having many of my reflections already expressed. So rather than risk polite repetition, I want to focus instead on some implications of George's book for contemporary Orthodox church life. And I will take as my example the Serbian Orthodox Church and the crisis it is in today. It's the church to which I belong. So when on 1st November 2024, the canopy of a major Serbian railway station collapsed soon after the building's renovation, killing 16 people and injuring several others, the country seemed to reach a breaking point. The tragedy was widely perceived as a symptom of the systemic corruption that has come to define public institutions under President Aleksandar Vučić, exemplified in this case by the practice of awarding public construction contracts through political patronage. The collapse followed a series of other national tragedies, among them the Belgrade shooting in May, a school shooting in May 23, and a steady stream of smaller, everyday acts of violence that eroded public trust and darkened the country's moral landscape. The students moved fast. They organized silent vigils and blocked major intersections for as many minutes as the number of those who had died. They occupied university buildings, often with the support of professors and deans. They began to walk across the country from city to city to draw attention to the pervasive corruption that had hollowed out Serbia's institutions. And as they walked, they were greeted by astonished citizens. Some embraced them with tears or tended their blistered feet. Others laid out a table of food and drink that at times stretched more than 1,000 meters, no, more than 100 meters. After decades of humiliation from the wars of the 1990s to the uncertain transitions that followed, Serbia, silenced by Georgia, began to reclaim its political voice and human dignity. Now, particularly striking is how many of the vigils have drawn consciously in church language and ritual gesture. Civic processions reminiscent of late antiquity, icons and crosses carried through the streets, hymn singing, and moments of collective silence, phrased by many as prayer. Many of the students are practicing Orthodox Christians, and the protests have welcomed the public manifestation of religious identity. So we're now nearly a year later, and the protests continue nearly daily, sometimes gathering hundreds of thousands in Belgrade and other cities. And why I suspect many of you don't know about this is a different story. We can talk about that another time. Students and their supporters are regularly beaten, sometimes seriously. They're detained, arrested, and tried. Their businesses are vandalized or burned. Many have lost jobs, including teachers who supported their high school students' participation in the protests. A striking image remains: protesters standing in commemorative silence at an intersection, only to be run over by one of Vucic's supporters. Yet, despite this transformative movement and its broad support across Serbian society, most of the upper hierarchy of the Serbian Orthodox Church has remained silent. Even Patriarch Porphyry, once regarded as progressive, has increasingly supported the regime. Worse still, theologians and priests who publicly supported the protests have been stripped of their academic posts, parishes, or ecclesiastical positions. So all this raises the question, why? It is precisely this question that George's book helps illuminate. Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium examines how Byzantine liturgical hymnography, over the centuries, became entangled with imperial political conceptions, resulting in the sacralization of violence. Innovatively engaging hymnography as its primary archive, the book traces a subtle but consequential shift. Byzantine hymnography gradually sacralized imperial violence, by weaving the church ever more tightly to the imperial state's project and, in doing so, eroded the prophetic distance the church must preserve from power. Among the book's many contributions, two are especially noteworthy. First, Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium shows that liturgical hymnography provides a uniquely fruitful witness to changing theological conceptions of violence, and by extension to shifting church-state relations. Second, the book demonstrates how historical events, from sieges and military campaigns to imperial victories, came to infiltrate liturgical hymnody, reshaping the identity of individual Christians from bearers of Christ to dutiful citizens of a divinely sanctioned empire. Two akoulothai associated with military life, one before battle and one for fallen soldiers, are given a liturgical logic. Territorial defense and even conquest, when imperially sanctioned, become holy. The ruler becomes a divine interlocutor, and the fallen soldier joins the ranks of the innocents slaughtered by Herod, though, as George notes, they're never explicitly made martyrs. In telling this story, the book moves from Egeria's Jerusalem and the Anastasis Cathedral to the cathedral rites of Constantinople and the desert monasteries of Palestine. Now, as a historian of liturgy who often engages with medieval Slavic material, I find George's discussion particularly stimulating. Slavic Christians had to wrestle with the entangled imperial liturgical forms inherited from Byzantium. Consider the hymn already mentioned several times, Save the Lord Your People, for the exaltation of the cross, discussed in chapter 5. In the Byzantine version, the hymn petitions victory for emperors against barbarians and divine protection for the empire. In its Slavic reception, however, the hymn was adapted to omit imperial governments and the mention of barbarians, in part because, as George points out, the Slavs themselves fell into the category of barbarians. The Slavic version instead positions the pious Orthodox against their adversaries, omitting any mention of imperial rule. But this shift, however, does not remove the empire from its context. It merely redefines its boundaries. The barbarians become the non-Orthodox. The imperial imagery is redirected toward emerging Slavic polities. And over time, this allowed hymnography to blend seamlessly with medieval Slavic imperial aspirations. The medieval South Slavic reception of these motifs reveals both the durability and the adaptability of this liturgical imagination. On the eve of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, Prince Lazar and his soldiers are said to have celebrated a liturgy in a portable military tent, echoing the Byzantine akoulothai before battle discussed in the book. In the aftermath of their defeat, a new feast day emerged to commemorate the battle, complete with its own cycle of hymns. This liturgical poetry transformed Lazar into a Christ-like ruler who chose the heavenly over the earthly kingdom. The hymnography of Vidovdan, as the feast is called, thus both inherits and subverts its Byzantine precedents. The ruler remains divinely appointed, Yet his victory is achieved through sacrificial loss rather than conquest. In this sense, the Vidovdan hymnography stands closer to Sunday hymns of the ancient Georgian clericals. Yet even here tension persists. The politicization of these images under Milosevic in the 1990s shows how enduringly potent the language of sanctified struggle remains, and how easily it can be manipulated, especially in the culture where liturgical memory is deeply entrenched. Milosevic co-opted the Vidovdan hymnography to rally soldiers under his nationalist banner. Then Patriarch Pavle responded famously and fearlessly. If the setting up of our independent state were possible only at a cost of time, I would rather wish that not only Greater Serbia, but also small Serbia and all the Serbs, including myself, may vanish than accede to anything unrighteous and heinous. That is what the vow of Kosovo expressed in the hymnography, and the commitment to the celestial kingdom means to me. So the beatified patriarch thus refuses to let Christian liturgy be used as a tool of political bellicosity. George points to another corrective. Alongside the imperial idiom of triumph present in some hymnography, there exists a counter-tradition of lament, especially in the Economia of Holy Saturday, in which violence is reinterpreted through the Passion of Christ. So returning to the present conflict in Serbia, between a church hierarchy wary of protest and a populace reclaiming political and even ecclesiastical agency, Patriarch's perfidious posture should not simply be read as complicity with power. It reflects a more complex inheritance, the Byzantine ideal of symphonia, the harmony of church and empire, combined with the living memory of communist persecution, which has taught many still living church leaders that open political conflict can endanger the church's fragile autonomy and impede its spiritual mission. The result, at best, is a cautious ecclesial diplomacy, shaped more by fear of renewed marginalization than by conviction in the divine right of rulers. Yet at the same time, a question remains. Will the church remain tethered to structures of power, or will it recover its role as a medium of repentance and transfiguration? The processions of students through Serbia's streets stand as a vivid reminder that the formation of Christian memory, including its liturgical expression, is never actually complete, and that the liturgy retains the power to console, to guide, and to transfigure.
Should I stay here?
I think, come up here, can you?
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I told my students that if they wanted to see a public grilling of their professor, they should come to this. What I didn't tell them is that everybody up here is my friend. And for Susan especially has been my mother in the academy for decades, and I'm just so honored and touched, and really all of you. I really, really appreciate everything you have to say, and you know, the support of the university to even have the time to do these kinds of projects, as Brenda said. Anyway, I'm really flattered. I want to let other people talk, but let me offer a couple comments of response to each of you. Your insights were all just really, really brilliant. I mean, Susan, every question you asked, I still have, right? You know, it's yeah. It really is. One comment you very generously point to the two methodological you call them insights that I have. Well, the second one, to take hymns seriously and as the medium that presents religious teaching effectively, I learned that from her. Right? I learned that by reading her. One of the things, like, I'm a bit of a fraud on the table or on the stage with the three of them. They are real, globally leading experts in liturgy, and I'm a total poser who had a few questions about finance, right? So it's really flattering, and yeah, Suzanne, I learned all that by reading you. Your questions, yeah, I chatted them, or I wrote them all down. I love the phrase, the feast, although my wife won't, the feast of the exaltation as a war monument to Christ. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't start that way, but it becomes that in the early 7th century. Yeah. Alex, I love how you recalibrated everything I did, and I think you just demonstrated just so potently that if I had actually paid attention, well, if I had paid attention to the music, first of all, I'm tone deaf. Second of all, I literally just don't have the skill to do it, right? But if, maybe if we had written the book together, because there is clearly so, like, what you could do to this project would amplify it 100-fold, right? To be able to see, like, where the pitch changes on the words and what does that do, and it would go a long way, I think, to answering some of Susan's questions about how does this get absorbed, how is it being structured so that it will be absorbed, right? Yeah, I mean, all of that is just, it's just really so great. And I love what you did to my last chapter where, again, I'm just showing that I'm just scratching the surface here and I don't even have the skills to do it, right? The way you went in, you actually went to the manuscripts. I didn't go to the manuscripts, I went to the edited volumes at Dunbar Knox's library, right? I didn't go to the manuscripts, I didn't know those textual clues, right? I don't even know that I would have had the training to even be able to lift them out. So I hope that the book can in some ways, I know you're a busy guy, but encourage you or your students or whoever to go and do this work. And then Nina, I love that you brought this to the Serbian story. Like when you started speaking and you said you were going to do today, I just assumed you did Russia, right? And I love that you didn't. I love that you talked about the Serbian situation, which I know a little bit about, only because of some of my colleagues and some of the doctoral students around here, and because of public orthodoxy, right? But boy, would I love you to write that for public orthodoxy, right? I mean, that would be really great. And I know you know him personally, the patriarch, right? I can totally understand how it's not one thing, right? It's pulling on a lot of traditions, being pulled in a lot of different ways, and I welcome and I heartily endorse your push to complexify simple explanations for what's motivating him, and even the hierarchy as a whole, even if there are times when maybe we should be critical of them or push them, prod them in a certain, which is what public orthodoxy is for, it's the right force. Anyway, I'll stop there, just to say thank you all, really. It's really quite an honor. And we'll take some, we'll let Brenna moderate, we'll take some questions from the floor and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you, George. What a wonderful conversation, a wonderful set of papers and comments, and George, thank you for your generous response. I'm thrilled that we have some time for several questions and comments, so let me open up the floor. Yes, Matthew. And if you could introduce yourself, we've got students from all different areas of the university and outside yourself, so just introduce yourself and ask away.
Sounds good. I'm Matthew Holter. I'm a second year PhD student in theology. So my question was this. So in what ways do the liturgical developments molded by the geopolitical events and violence of the 7th century, particularly the conflict with the emerging caliphate, inform, obscure, or even taint a common lay person's understanding of sacred scripture? And then more specifically, in what ways can you, or just a historian generally, understand how the lay person's understanding of liturgy through the hymns, etc., differed from the views expressed by early Christian intellectuals and exegetes, and can you? So.
I don't know if that's a question for me or Susie, because she can probably answer that.
Yeah, I guess
Well, let me explain what the argument of the book is. Right.
Okay.
So the argument of the book is that there are exceptions, to be sure, but as a general rule, before the Arab conquest of Jerusalem, which occurs in the first half of the 7th century, there is lots and lots and lots of evidence of hymns that engage violence. But most of the time when that happens, it's reflecting on the violence that Christ endured, occasionally on the violence that the martyrs endured, and it has salvific power, right? It's because Christ suffered this that we have the possibility to be saved. Beginning in the 7th century, when this Feast of the Holy Cross, and especially this hymn gets commissioned, this Save, O Lord, your people, the feast moves from Jerusalem to Constantinople. It's commissioned by the emperor. The feast is transformed. That opens up a new window. It's never the dominant one, but it opens up this new window where, in the context of liturgy, Christians of the Roman Empire are asking God to either grant victory or to literally destroy on the battlefield their enemies. And there's some little hints of it before that, but it becomes this important thread that will grow in certain sections. So that's kind of the argument of the book. What does that do to Scripture? The Psalms had always been there, right? And so there are these Psalms that had requested violence. To my knowledge, and people here may know more than me, to my knowledge, when the church fathers who predate that 7th century space comment on those Psalms, they never interpret them as an authorization for the Romans to go to war, or for them to go to war. They always internalize them, they allegorize them, and so forth. They never interpret it literally as a justification or an authorization for war. To be honest, I don't even know if they go back and do that afterwards. But the hymns seem to do that.
Yeah. And that would have informed the laypersons.
Yeah. I mean, Susan, do you want to add to this at all?
I want to underscore something Nina brought up, and in stark contrast to the Emperor Leo composing hymns. I think there's a way in which the language of hymns, such as the language of the Psalms as well, for the singers, for the people in the congregation at any given point, in any given century, it falls into some kind of timelessness. So when you're reading, or when you're chanting the Psalms, and you chant, my enemies surrounded me, and in the name of the Lord I destroyed them, from Psalm 117 or something like that. You're not thinking about a war that's taking place. You're thinking about, whatever one thinks about on Sunday morning, whatever century you're in. But I think the point Nina was raising about how these words would sound different to people for whom the legacy is a different legacy is really important. How were they interpreted? So most of the time I work in Syriac tradition, Syriac Orthodoxy. Syriac Orthodoxy is there from day one. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Syriac is an Aramaic dialect. Never have Syriac Orthodox Christians been in their 2,000 years of history, have they ever been in a position of political power. They have always been a marginal people. The Greek, Roman, Byzantine Empire ruled over them, or the Caliphate, and now either they're still in the Middle East or they're now in a secularized West. So they've never interpreted, they haven't been in a place to interpret politically what were theological. The starkest contrast I think of is the Virgin Mary, who from the 5th century, from the early 5th century with the Christological decisions, in Byzantine icons you clothe the Virgin Mary in the robes of the empress. She looks like an empress. And of course, in the medieval West, you put the crown, of the, right? In Syriac Orthodoxy, Mary is the daughter of the poor. Eventually, in actually fairly recent history, 18th, 19th century, with the arrival of the strong presence of Catholic Christianity in the Middle East, you see Mary crowned as the Queen of Heaven. But that's not the bulk of it. So when you're tied to a political entity, I think the words sound different than I really do. And I think we have this, I think I can produce evidence for that, for the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th century. And I think that Nina was just citing, a parallel as well. That specter of empire, and George brings this out from the very beginning and the very end, where you do call into account recent Russian actions. Empire is a heavy legacy that the Greek and Russian churches in particular carried. And the words sound different from inside that legacy, I think, than they sound from outside it.
Your question about the reinterpretation of Scripture, though, is also an important one because the tradition of writing all these hymns comes mostly from the Church of Jerusalem. Certainly, as you point out, Jerusalem during the period of Justinian, it really kind of gets going while the empire is still there. But the thing is, the old rite of Hagia Sophia had very, very few hymns. It consisted mostly of psalms. And so when you introduce a hymn like Lord Save Your People, it would be repeated as a refrain between every verse of Psalm 50. And that might be one of 3 special hymns to be sung that day at Matins. Otherwise, it was just all the ordinary psalms. So that you could cause a reinterpretation, in some cases by adding new refrains, and that's sort of going back earlier, that's what St. John Chrysostom talks about with the battles with the Arians, whose refrains to the psalms essentially were being added. But then the thing is too that then in a rite like of Hagia Sophia, which was like that of old Rome and not in being largely scriptural, that then it's inevitable that then people start using those particular let God arise, let his enemies be scattered, and everything else, all those sorts of things, and reinterpreting them in a particular way that is newly political. I mean, we see this, some sort of reinterpretations in the same period going on in other parts of the empire that weren't attacked by the Arabs. We find it in say, the changes in the cult of St. Demetrius in Thessaloniki, where the St. Demetrius of early Christianity is a friend of children and a teacher. And then he is during with the Slavs, the Avars, everybody else who's attacking the city, he becomes one of the warrior saints of the Orthodox Church. But if you've seen that in this basilica, there is one of those early Christian mosaics of him there with 2 little children in his hand, and that's his early life stories, the Vitae. They tell that story. So there really is a change that you can so it's not only about Christ and so on, but it also affects views of the saints.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question and the answer. Yes, go ahead, right there, front row.
My name is Pablo Smitsuk. I'm a visiting scholar at NYU Jordan Center. I have 2 questions. One for George. So I didn't read the book. I think I've seen 1 or 2 draft chapters. And the question is about the distinction between defensive violence and aggressive violence. And I think at a certain point you make the point that there is really none. The distinction doesn't exist, at least in some hymns.
Yeah, well, or I asked the question, would the Byzantines have made that, we make that distinction now, would the Byzantines have made that distinction? I'm not so sure.
You don't see this at all in the text. No.
Well, it's definitely, so especially in the last chapter, and I think I shared this with you, in the last chapter, so this prayer service before soldiers go into battle, and then the memorial service for fallen soldiers and prisoners of war, prisoners of war who die in prison. you have both what we would make that distinction, and in both of those services, you have hymns that are in asking God for defense, and then in some of the hymns, you have hymns that are asking God to be aggressive, right? In the pre-war battle, there's literally a request to the Virgin Mary to let the arrows of the army burn the bodies of the enemies, right? So to send flaming arrows and to have their bodies like burn, and like asking the Virgin to do this. So you clearly have these requests for active violence alongside defensive violence. We make that distinction today because we come out, we're influenced by the Catholic just war tradition and so forth and so on. And so we make these distinctions between defensive wars and wars of aggression. Cicero, he makes that distinction. I don't know that the Byzantines really would make that distinction. I mean, if three Byzantines here, they might have something to say. I don't see any distinction in the text. Both are there. Yeah.
And a question to Nina, if I may. Since you try to apply, George's ideas to contemporary situation, also within orthodoxy, do you think that this violent rhetoric has a place, theologically grounded place in, defensive war, anti-colonial wars where, Christians in Ukraine, in Middle East, elsewhere are fighting and killing for their defense, or it's outdated, you would say?
Well, you asked me, does it have a place? I mean, the liturgy still functions, and there's still sung. And I think it's really important what everyone has said, which is that liturgy is always getting reincarnated into a specific context. And so, like biblical hermeneutics, it's always in some ways getting reinterpreted, of course, with the width of tradition, right, that the person carries and the liturgy carries. So there are like correctives in place, but it's always reinterpreted. So it's there. I think it can play very different roles. I mean, as somebody who heard the hymn sung in different liturgical contexts of the Slavs, it sounds very different to me. Lord, Savior, say their people and bless the inheritance. For example, when I first heard it actually in the Georgian monastery in the Holy Land, where it was connected to the actual monastery of the Holy Cross, where it really sounds extremely different than when I heard it in the Russian Orthodox parish that I regularly attended in Rome, that had, and also specifically it's a Roman Russian parish, so a certain diplomatic dimension as well. It had a very much a different tone to it, So I think liturgy reflects cultural and historical reality and engages it and aims to transfigure it. I don't know if I'm kind of answering your question or not. You wanted me to take a stand. My stand is that war has always been there, but liturgy is not. Liturgy is there to transfigure the world. And how you do that, you do it in a lot of different ways. And if it's not doing that, then we have an issue.
I'll not, and Susan's heard me say this already in a conference, but so the memorial service had not been translated into English before. And I really wrestled with whether or not to translate it. I mean, I had to translate it to work on it, but I really wrestled with whether or not to publish a translation of it, which I did. It's in volume because, I'm sitting in the context, I mean, not like you, published from Ukraine. But I really wrestled with the, do I publish this translation that Patriarch Kirill can manipulate, right, to just further authorize the invasion, right? And I think one of the most challenging parts of the research was Pandeli from Volos invited me to give a webinar, and there were several people on the webinar who were from Ukraine, like living in Ukraine, following the thing. And I'm this cushy Westerner who can talk about these things in totally abstract ways, and I can, in my kind of progressive way, just look down on, military and so forth and so on. And I get this flood of emails afterwards from these Christians in Ukraine who are saying these prayers over their children before they go to bed for fear that they're not going to wake up, right? And anyway, it was really, really enlightening to sort of think about the weight of the relevance of these services today, you know. So anyway.
Thank you, that was a great question, those were powerful answers, thank you so much. Other hands? Yes.
I'm Catherine. I'm a sophomore and taking Women of the Christians with Dr. Demacopoulos. I haven't read the book yet, so forgive me if this is not really relevant, but when there are these requests for violence from like Christ, how does that and does it change the view of martyrdom and how like martyrs are respected and who are asking for violence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I will say, when I first planned the book, I thought I would do an entire chapter on the Tropadia. So these are kinds of short hymns about martyrs, right? Because I just assumed that the Tropadium for St. George or St. Demetrius or St. Catherine or right all of these martyrs, that there would be violence in the hymns. And the fascinating thing was I ended up not writing a chapter because there's no violence in the hymns. Like none. Like I must have gone through a dozen of the obvious ones. And the Tropadia, of course now Alex is going to correct me. But then I couldn't find, there was not enough material there. So that in and of itself to me is really, really fascinating because most of those hymns are kind of written in the Middle Byzantine period or even later after all of this has already happened. And so after this transition has taken place, the people who are writing the hymns about the martyrs are still not thinking in terms of violence. They're thinking in terms of the ability of the saint to intercede on behalf of the Christian community. And so that's, the short hymn is typically 3 or 4 lines. And that's typically what the hymns for the martyrs are doing. So I found that like really, really surprising that it doesn't change it.
Thank you, great question. Can I insert myself here in the lineup and ask a question? So I would love to.
You're chair of the department.
All right. So I would love to, George, if you could just, show us a little bit of your thought processes here. So what I really loved about this book, so I work on modern Catholicism and primarily French, late 19th, early 20th century. And there is just so much it's a very poetically rich period in Christian history. And I love that you take hymns, and then as you say in here though, that hymns as a data, as a source, you say they're slippery, they're poetic in nature, and that's just so true. Like I have my equivalent of it's like devotional life, basically. And that, what the hymnographer had in mind might be different with the devotee and so forth. So it's this really slippery, poetic material to hold on to. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit how you wrestled with that on the one hand, the poetic, unstable nature of your primary source, with, your conclusion, comes down kind of hard in the sense that you really, if I understood you, I mean, he has this, I would urge everyone to get the book, it's a beautifully written book, that you say at the end of the book, I found it very moving that you really say that the eventual sacralization of violence eventually gives precedent for later periods that want to justify the demonization of refugees, political enemies, migrants, refugees, historical enemies, minorities, the millennial-long liturgical tradition for authorizing violence. And so in this, it's like these you see them in this part of your argument as kind of stable poetic sources that can justify real political hierarchy and violence. So I would just love to hear you just say, like, how did you grapple with like the instability on the one hand of your primary sources and your sense in which you see these as becoming fixed in a dangerous way in a historical time and place. So just like tell us your thought process.
Yeah. So I will say that the whole idea for this book came out of a study group that I was a part of 15 years ago, back when I was almost 20 years ago, when I was a much younger scholar. There was a group of pre-tenured Orthodox scholars who would get together in Boston twice a year, and we just sort of, we would share our work, right? We all need tenure. We would share our work, and we decided to do a project together on violence, war and violence in the Orthodox tradition. The book's actually been translated into Ukrainian recently. And I wrote mine on Eusebius and Ambrose and so forth. And Eusebius, even though he's the father of my guild, right? He's the father of church history, I really dislike Eusebius. I think he's a terrible person. Because he, well, anyway, I don't have to go into all that, but in that context, in that group, we kept doing this hymn, Soson Kyrie, so that's the Greek. So, O Lord, save your people. So everybody's kept hearing me. So the hymn it's really brief. It's, O Lord, save your people and bless your inheritance. Grant victory to the emperor against the barbarians, and save your commonwealth through the cross. Right? So this grant victory to the emperor against the barbarians. And we all would we all went to Holy Cross. It's the hymn of Holy Cross. It's the hymn of the seminary, right? So the hymn of the seminary in the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States is singing 5 times a day, grant victory to the emperor. Who's the emperor now? Like who is this emperor to whom we're praying for now? Against the barbarians. Who are the barbarians? Well, we're Americans, so we're the barbarians, right? And I just couldn't make sense of it, right? And anyway, I had to write the tenure book. I did other things, and then I came back to it, and I'm like, where in the world did this hymn come from? So in a sense, that's where the project came from. Like the whole book is, where does this hymn come from? And am I right in thinking this hymn is deeply problematic? Right? My axe to grind in the book is this hymn is deeply, deeply problematic. And what's interesting is the Antiochian tradition has changed it. The Serbian tradition has changed it, right?
Yes, all the Slavs.
All the Slavs have changed it. In the OCA, in Greece they've changed it because you can't say emperor in Greece, so it's grant victory to the people.
After the change in the monarchy, though.
Right,
The monarchy
correct.
was
So,
abolished.
right.
So Canada and the UK, we can still say that.
Yeah. So it's Canada, the UK, and the United States. The
Wow.
Greeks in these places are the only ones still singing the 7th century version. But that means I. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I think honestly, George, that story is so helpful because it's rooted in your kind of liturgical experience and then asking kind of a political question about that liturgical experience, because I think often in our field, people that work on politics read rational discourse, political theology, or what did the emperor say, and the devotional world sometimes can be kind of apolitical, but I think that you occupy with your own person both of those worlds, teaching courses on post-colonial and decolonial violence and so forth, but also having this interior life that is so grounded in the church. Yeah, so that's really
I never answered your question. The short answer to your question is, I guess what I'm trying to say in the introduction is I'm acknowledging that these are really, really slippery, and I can't ever say for one person, one group of people that they meant X.
Yeah.
But by the time I get to the conclusion, what I can say, or what I can speculate, just because I go around and I read, I meet people, I read things. For some people, a hymn like Soson Kyrie, right, is an authorization of empire.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right? And once you have an authorization of empire, then it's a very quick step to Putin. No, really. It's a very quick step to Putin and to Kirill, right? Once you have an authorization for empire.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I'm just looking at the time. Wait.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Hi, Kathy. George's wife.
So yeah, I'm Kathy Demacopoulos, I'm George's wife. But I find it really interesting what you just pointed out, that really only the Greeks, the UK and Canada still sing this version of the song.
Yeah.
Of the hymn. And I happen to know that you shared part of this talk, I believe, in a group of clergy, right? Wasn't this what you gave talk to? I'm just curious what the,
No, I did the
Orthodox?
Jewish, I did the anti-Semitism. of
but you
it.
certainly have
Yeah.
gotten responses to
Yes.
this work from
Yes.
hierarchs and clergy in the Greek Orthodox Church. So
Yes.
what has there been any response of, oh, we should change the lyrics?
No.
Or is the response more, we can't change anything?
No, I found when I speak to groups of clergy, I have found a much warmer reception to dropping the anti-Semitic hymns for Good Friday, and even for the restoration of like female altar servers and deaconesses. When I bring up this hymn, they don't want to hear it. Either because I think it's just too esoteric and nobody's paying attention to the words, and they don't necessarily follow the line of thought that once you have an endorsement of empire, you get Putin and Kirill. They're like, I think we all see that. I don't think any of them see that.
You never know what seeds are planted.
Yeah.
Yes, okay,
Can I
final
ask a quick
word?
question? I know they were out of time.
Yes.
I guess one of the things I continuously struggle with reading the book, and now with what you said, is we already have authorization of empire constantly. So there's a whole heritage of Christian imperial identity. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course, yeah. So how do we square that with slippery slope from the hymn?
Yeah.
Rooted, right?
Yeah, well, I guess the question is Byzantium normative for Orthodoxy? And my next project is arguing no. It's literally called Orthodox Christianity and the Specters of Byzantium. Because Byzantium's the problem, not the solution.
Byzantium can be the problem.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us for this discussion of Sacralizing Violence in Byzantium by George Demacopoulos, our beloved colleague. And thank you so much to our presenters. This was wonderful. And the questions, thank you so much for joining us tonight.